Alright, today we're going to talk about groundwater. So when we talk about groundwater, there's a couple things you want to keep in mind. We want to know how groundwater formed, what are the zones of subsurface water and their characteristics. So basically, what are the underground zones where water is held, what is a water table, how does groundwater move, and what is porosity and permeability. And those should be very familiar because those are vocabulary words. So you may want to have your vocabulary handy as we go through it. We also want to know what an aquifer is and the two different types of aquifers that we're going to discuss. We're also going to look at things that can go wrong with wells when you're pumping groundwater and what karst topography is. So let's start with the origination of groundwater. It comes from the water cycle. So water rains, it comes down, it either becomes runoff and enters into surface water, or it's going to infiltrate into the ground to become part of groundwater. So infiltration is when it goes from the surface down towards the ground and eventually into an aquifer where it can become part of the zone of saturation in groundwater. So there are several zones underground that we want to keep in mind. We have the zone of aeration, which is mostly air, directly below the surface, and then the zone of saturation, which is completely full of water, and that's where groundwater is going to be found. So if you were looking at it, you'd have your zone of aeration at the top, and then your zone of saturation below. This little area here is the water level, or the water table, and that's where water is going to go up or down depending on whether water is being taken out or put back in. Now, as groundwater moves underground, you have to consider porosity, or the space between sediments, and we checked that with a lab in class by pouring water into different materials and seeing how much water they could hold. The water occupied the space, and that was our porosity. Permeability is the ability of water to move through a material. This sometimes depends on porosity because you need space for it to be there, but it also is going to depend on how much space is connected so that it can move to it quickly. And we did the little demo in class where we had the different materials, and we found out if you mix different materials like the gravel and the round pebbles and the sand, it actually did slow the water down because the sand filled in some of that space where water would have run through the gravel as it did in class. Now, some different porosities to consider. Clay has a high porosity even though it doesn't have any space connected. That clay gets compacted so it actually doesn't allow water to move through. A good aquifer would be something like sandstone that has pretty high porosity but also is permeable. And we want it to be permeable so that water can move through it because we're going to have to suck the water out of the aquifer to use it in our wells. So this is a little diagram. This is showing you've got your upper part of the stream where it's thinner and it widens as you come out. There aren't any tributaries in this picture. So how does the water increase from here to here? Well, the answer is groundwater. Groundwater is going to add to it to make it a little bit more water once it gets towards the end. So you're having groundwater and tributaries adding to rivers and streams as they get older or as they get further downstream. So you're getting more water. Now the two types of aquifers, the first one is unconfined. That means they're not sealed off at any point, so they're open at the top and you have to pump the water out. And recharge, that filling can happen from anywhere, which means if it's on a farm, the cow fertilizers and things that are naturally put there by the cows actually can enter into your water and become part of your groundwater if it's not confined. The opening just goes straight down from the surface. So unconfined aquifer would be here at the top. You have your water table. This is your zone of saturation. Then this area here is just soil in the zone of aeration. And the water would just come from the surface straight down. Now, the other alternative would be a confined aquifer, and that's what we use artesian wells for. They're sealed at the top. They transmit water from a certain location, like the top of a mountain, as we did in our diagrams on our worksheet. And they're confined and under pressure. So if you drill into them, water will flow to the surface naturally. So this would be a confined aquifer. The top of the mountain here is the recharge area. The water flows in between two rocks, so it's under pressure. You drill in, the water would squirt out. Now, the cone of depression is going to actually occur as you suck the water out. So if I were this well here, as I'm sucking water out, well, this one's old school, but if it were a pumped well, instead of being by hand, you would actually create a cone of depression around it. Now this old school well is really good though to just show you that you drill down. When you drill this hole into the zone of saturation, water's going to pour in from the sides and fill up the bottom of the well, and then you just drop your pail in and then soak up that water that's already pooled at the bottom. I'm not going to show you the animation. It doesn't actually work very well. But the idea is that as you're sucking water out with a mechanical pump, it's sucking the water like a straw. It creates this drawdown in cone of depression as the water table goes down as the water is sucked out. All right, now some problems with this. We talked about it in class. We looked at natural gas from fracking being an issue. We talked about different pollutants that can get in there, one being saltwater invasion. That's when it comes from the ocean. In Virginia, that's a particular problem. From the Chesapeake Bay being hit by an asteroid to form the Chesapeake Bay millions of years ago, it actually cracked the underlying rock and created some fractures that allow water to be sucked in if you live in the coastal areas. When you're sucking it in from your well, it can actually pull salt water into your groundwater. Now, another problem that you might have, we looked at in class, so if you put in too many wells in one area, it can cause drawdown and actually make other wells go dry. We looked at how waste is filtered out naturally, so you don't want to be too close to an area where it hasn't been filtered yet. We looked at sewage from septic tanks and allowing room for the septic tank to leach through and purify your water before building. We talked about the earthquakes causing some fractures or cracks in the rock that don't allow for filtering. And then we also talked about the changing of flow with a septic tank if you have over pumping and it caused the sewage to go back up into the well. Now, karst topography is our last topic, and that's what occurs with limestone areas like Luray Caverns, for example. In Virginia, our karst regions are here in what's called the Valley and Ridge province. And in that region, you see lots of caves and caverns, and the limestone in those areas are dissolved by slightly acidic groundwater, and then they precipitate out to create the stalactites on the ceiling and the stalagmites on the floor, and they connect together to form columns of caves, not caves, columns that connect together. Another occurrence would be a disappearing stream where it just looks like it goes into the ground somewhere and you don't see it. And then sinkholes. This is a Florida sinkhole. Poor Florida. They have lots of limestone and they have lots of sinkholes as caves collapse from the weight of overlying material. And here's another picture. That's Luray Caverns. So just keep in mind as you're reviewing, you want to make sure that you go over karst topography, porosity and permeability, your vocabulary words, and you want to take a look at your two types of aquifers and start reviewing those for the tests.